All my fond love thus do I blow to heaven. 'Tis gone. Arise, black vengeance, from the hollow hell. Othello, from William Shakespeare's Othello, 1603. Domingo, Casongo, Isabel, Francisco, Simon Valencia, Susanna Pivas, James Onsumbi, Isabel Peter, Christopher Cape Vert, and John Cumquick. These are just some of the names of black Londoners in the late 16th century, a population that may have approximated 1 to 3% of the total population of the city in the years just prior to the founding of Jamestown. In one city parish, St. Botolph's Aldgate, at least 25 people of color appear in the parish records as having been baptized. Recent research for the book Black Tudors has uncovered the names of at least 360 black English men and women who lived in Tudor and Stuart Britain. Many were servants, dancers, musicians, and entertainers. They were working class and urban, mostly in Bristol and London. For the most part, they were integrated into British society, some more so than others. They also faced racism and prejudice, although British attitudes varied. Yet they have been largely forgotten, even though they lived 300 years before the landing of the Windrush, the traditional beginning of today's Afro-British community. But in order to understand English attitudes towards the Africans at Jamestown in 1619, we must first examine their attitudes about Africans in England. In the earliest days of Tudor England, Africans were rarely seen, and when seen, were written of as curiosities. England was still relatively provincial and had yet to participate in colonization. Long gone were the days of the Roman Empire, when Britain was far more ethnically diverse. But a notable exception was a man named John Blank, who was a trumpeter in the court of King Henry VII. He likely arrived in England in the entourage of Catherine of Aragon when she married the future King Henry VIII. He appears on the Westminster Tournament Roll, which was held in honor of the birth of Henry, the son of the new King Henry VIII. The boy sadly died 10 days later, a death that would ultimately have an enormous impact on English history. And after Henry VIII became king, he retained John Blank's services, and the trumpeter asked for a raise, and Henry VIII doubled his weekly wages. Black musicians were common in the courts of medieval Europe, from the Medicis in Italy to the all-African drum band in the Edinburgh court of King James's father. John Blank is typical of black Europeans at the time, depicted both as different and yet like everyone else. Yet in the church, people of African features weren't merely tolerated, they were venerated. Saint-Maurice was an Egyptian-born Roman general said to have lived in the 3rd century AD. Maurice was a Christian at a time before the Roman Empire embraced the faith, and he commanded an all-Christian Roman legion. This legion found itself in trouble for refusing orders to pursue and kill other Christians. They were punished with decimation, and following Maurice's lead, when they continued to disobey, the entire legion was killed, including its commander, at a place now called Saint-Maurice, Switzerland. While the historicity of this story is disputed, and no one knows Maurice's actual appearance, he became particularly important to German-speaking Christians as their local hero and church martyr. Saint Maurice became the patron saint of the Germanic Holy Roman Empire in the 10th century. By the 12th century, Saint Maurice was almost always depicted as a sub-Saharan African. He was depicted as a brave hero and wise man, and not as subservient. His image remains in paintings and statues all throughout Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. Yet by the 1550s, as the transatlantic slave trade changed European attitudes towards Africans, Saint Maurice was mostly depicted as a white man when he was even mentioned at all. He was not the last church figure this would happen to. A similar thing will happen to a pop culture icon of England and Northern Europe from the 13th century. Before there were action figures in Marvel Comics, there were the superheroes of the Arthurian legends, popular tales of knights, honor, and chivalry, mostly written in medieval France and England. When we picture the Knights of the Round Table, we can imagine their swords and armor, their valiant deeds and courtly dialect. We imagine Europeans. But do we think of a knight who was, quote, all black, even as I tell ye? His head, his body, and his hands were all black, saving only his teeth. His shield and armor were even those of a Moor, and as black as a raven, unquote. He was Sir Morion, Lancelot's friend, whose earliest surviving depiction was from a 14th century Dutch translation of an earlier lost French manuscript. Morion, who was, quote, black in face and limb, was clearly intended to be described as a black man, even down to his name, Sir Morion. And while the term Moor also encompassed light-skinned Berbers and tanned Arabs, usually Muslim, in the Netherlands and Northern Europe in general at that time, Moor, or blackamoor, increasingly meant a sub-Saharan African, no matter their religion. Sir Morion was said to have been born of a Moorish princess and an errant Arthurian knight. While seeking his father, he duelled Lancelot to a draw and won the knight's respect and friendship. Morion, although only a teen, was a tall, handsome, brave, and wise knight, according to the story. He was a black man that white Europeans looked up to and celebrated. That is, until the story fell out of favor by the 1550s. After 1550, the depictions and descriptions of African people began to change in Europe. Portugal had been involved in African colonies for over 75 years, and along with Spain had shipped thousands of Africans across the Atlantic to a life of enslavement along the Caribbean basin. Now, with the expansion of Brazil, the slave trade exploded. England, too, would dip its toes into the colonial Atlantic, and while officially refraining from trading in the lives of Africans, there were prominent privateers, such as Sir Francis Drake and John Hawkins, doing so anyway. Some captured Africans even made it to England, mostly taken, not quite liberated, in wars with Spain, although some Africans willingly joined the English. Thus, the African-English population rapidly increased, added to the small black population already in London at the time of Queen Elizabeth I. By 1596, this was seen as a problem, as the Queen's Privy Council addressed the Lord Mayor of London to, quote, take up blackamoors here in this realm and to transport them into Spain and Portugal, unquote, with the consent of their masters. The consent was not granted, and the Lord Mayor shelved the request. A 1601 draft intended to go further when the Queen complained of, quote, the great number of Negroes and blackamoors which come to this realm to the great annoyance of her own liege people, unquote. But it was never sent. This appeal to patriotism and working class white angst would have fallen on deaf ears. The people of London didn't seem to care. Stratford-born but London resident William Shakespeare seemed to be one of them. He would have been quite familiar and even probably comfortable with the black London community he would have encountered daily. People of color appear in several Shakespeare works, notably Titus Andronicus and Othello. Titus Andronicus, written between 1588 and 1593, was Shakespeare's first tragedy. It was gory and sloppily written compared to his more famous later works, and although rarely staged today, was popular at the time. The play takes place in the latter days of the Roman Empire, between Romans and the Goths who they battle. The key villain is Aaron the Moor, a black man who plots against both the Goths and the Andronicus family, who put him down because of his race. Aaron is a cunning villain who directs most of the violence from behind the scenes. He both embraced and defied the racial stereotypes of the era, calling out, quote, is black so base a hue, unquote. Even as Aaron is caught and suffers a heinous death, he has no regrets, other than he could not live to kill more. In 1603's Othello, Shakespeare produced a black character that both embraced and defied stereotypes, yet in a more genteel and honorable character. Othello is a Moorish general, a black man who aids and rescues the very Italian people who in reality largely put him down for his race and color. His crime is to fall in love with the white Desdemona, and Shakespeare makes much of the terms of race and color in the play. The arch-villain Iago plots against Othello using racist language and age-old racial and sexual stereotypes, in one line telling Desdemona's father, quote, "Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe," unquote, and later, quote, "The devil will make a grandsire out of you," unquote, as Europeans were already associating blackness with the devil. Things end tragically for Othello as he cannot win in that society, his race and color used against him. It is a remarkable critique of race from 400 years ago and still resonates today. Yet not all English popular culture was as sympathetic. By 1605, Elizabeth had died and King James VI of Scotland had become James I of England. 2 years into his reign, his consort, Queen Anne of Denmark, commissioned Ben Jonson to stage a masque. Masks were elaborate productions with singing, fantastical sets, and outlandish costumes, much like Hollywood musicals of the 1930s and 1940s. They were usually reserved for holidays or state occasions and staged for the elite. This masque, Queen Anne wanted to participate along with her ladies-in-waiting in blackface. She and her attendants played African water nymphs, beautiful princesses of the god Niger. Yet those African beauties, according to the play, were told they weren't as fair as the ladies to the north. The plot deviates into a plan for the African women to become physically more light in skin by the metaphorical light of Britannia, ruled, of course, by none other than Anne's husband, James. It is full of racial stereotypes and English superiority and seems embarrassing today, but it is interesting as a text that may show, like Queen Elizabeth I, elite attitudes towards Africans compared to perhaps Shakespeare's more realistic characterizations shaped more likely from everyday experience. Yet both Jonson and Shakespeare's plays and verse were shaped by prose, a 1600 English translation of an African travel account. A description of Africa was published in 1550 by a Berber known as Leo Africanus, born Al-Hazan ibn Muhammad al-Wazan in Islamic Granada, Spain. Captured by Catholic Spaniards during the Reconquista, he was sent to work for the Pope when Al-Hazan's intelligence became obvious. And he worked for Pope Leo and thus was renamed Leo Africanus. While the veracity of much of the book has been challenged, Leo's work describing the geography and people of Africa, both positively and negatively, shaped the attitudes of the European elite for decades, and even centuries. Some of Leo's descriptions would echo in Jonson and Shakespeare's works, as a description of Africa was first translated into English in 1600 by John Pory, the same Pory that 19 years later was the Speaker of Virginia's first General Assembly at Jamestown, a few weeks prior to the arrival of the first Africans. These attitudes from highborn and lowborn, from church to pop culture, from theory and from experience, attitudes both racist and anti-racist, existed in English society before Jamestown and long before the Africans taken from Dongo were brought to Point Comfort in August 1619. Yet in these attitudes, we can glimpse much negativity coming from the elite of English society, while the rank and file of everyday London shrugged their shoulders and worked side by side with their black neighbors. This would play out in Virginia, as in our next video when we examine the rise of race and court cases and laws and the separation of enslaved Africans and white indentured servants that were, at one time, allies. Thanks for watching.